Thank you for joining our church online. We encourage you to visit citylightla.church for our service times, location, and upcoming events. If you enjoy our videos and would like to give to lives being changed in Los Angeles, visit citylightla.church/give.
Good morning, church. I'm excited to share the word with you this morning. Our pastor is on vacation right now with his family, enjoying a much-needed rest. Him and his wife and his daughters, but I'm excited to open up the Word with you this morning. For the last few months, can you believe it? It's been months since we first started the book of James, but it's been months now since we first started the book of James, and let me tell you, it's been one of the most challenging seasons in my time here at City Light. Some of the most transformational and convicting messages I've ever heard preached has been from this series, and I hope to add to the wealth of knowledge and conviction that the Holy Spirit has given to us through our pastor. And I truly believe that if we simply lean in and receive what God has in store for us today, that He will do exactly that. But I must confess something, that when our pastor asked me to share the word this morning, at first I was excited. And then I read the text. He told me, listen, I want you to cover James 5, 1 through 6. And I thought, okay, cool. Let me read James 5, 1 through 6. Oh, no. Oh, man. Oh, geez. And I realized from reading this that it was already stepping on my toes. Sure enough, this is going to step on a lot of people's toes. And so I say that to prepare you for a moment. Because what you're going to hear this morning, I'll be frank, is going to be hard to receive. But it's necessary. And as we'll come to discover, this isn't something that is isolated in just these 6 short verses. This is throughout the Bible. From beginning to end, we find this theme mentioned again and again and again. And I'd like to just clarify James's point of view and what he wants us to understand. So will you read this with me? James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. If you don't have a Bible, I encourage you can look up on the screen. The text is there. The Bible says in this, "Come now, you rich men. Weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire." Ouch. "You have stored up treasures for the last days. Indeed, the wages that you kept back by fraud from the laborers who harvested your fields are crying. And the cries of those who harvested have entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived in pleasure on the earth and have been wayward. You have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed the righteous man who does not resist you." Wealth has been an object of fascination for all of human history, while at the same time being an object of suffering for many others. And we see this. There have been countless stories surrounding wealth, whether that is the novel Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, TV shows like Succession or Keeping Up with the Kardashians, movies like Pursuit of Happiness and Parasite. These are stories that are told again and again and again surrounding wealth, rich versus poor, poor making their way through the difficulty and marginalization, and the rich getting their comeuppance. We see these stories told again and again and again. And when we read these stories, the natural inclination is to see ourselves as the poor man, to see ourselves as the downtrodden, to see ourselves as the hero of the story. It's very easy to see ourselves like that. But what comes to mind when you think of a rich people? maybe a large mansion, a Beamer, Louis Vuitton bag, Gucci apparel, six-figure income. What comes to mind when you think of rich person? When this text opens up and says, "Come now, you rich men," who do you think about? This image may be the reason that Bible warnings to the rich so often go unheeded. The very fact that right now, what many of us are picturing are celebrities that live up on the hill is one of the reasons why so many of the warnings in the Bible that we find towards the rich are ignored. Why? Because I believe that natural inclination to view ourselves as the poor reveals one of the biggest struggles in the church and world today. That is this: an unwillingness to see our own wealth, much less the damage caused by it. I know that's tough. Believe me, in studying this, it's not easy. But it's the truth. See, this tension between the rich and the poor has always been a divisive subject. And it is to this day. To say that socioeconomic disparities exist may sound like political rhetoric or conspiracy jargon. It might sound like, oh, I'm just sensationalizing this. But the Bible doesn't. And see, I believe that James is trying to convince us to quit the self-deception, to see ourselves as a rich and wealthy elite he's trying to address. And the truth is, church, this message, this text will mean nothing to any of us if we don't begin to see ourselves as the rich and wealthy that James is trying to address. If we don't see this text as a portion of text that's directed to you and me, then this will mean nothing. And we might as well just go home. And I know that's rough, but I say this way because James is coming off in the same tone. To honor the text, I cannot come up here and say this soft-spokenly because James doesn't. And so as harsh as he is, we have to understand this. And see, I could spend the next 20 minutes talking about statistics, comparing the average wealth of the American middle class to the rest of the world. I could give you charts and compare how other countries are disenfranchised or poorer than we are. But that honestly doesn't interest me. That doesn't interest me as much as our hearts. I don't want to be up here and give you statistics on the amount we earn compared to the rest of the world, because I believe what's important is the spirit with which we have been guilty of carrying because of our wealth. James Stewart of Scotland said it this way: "It is the function of economists, not the pulpit, to work out plans of reconstruction, but it is emphatically the function of the pulpit to stab men broad awake to the terrible pity of Jesus, to expose their hearts to the constraint of that divine compassion which halos the oppressed and suffering and flames in judgment at every social wrong." That's my job. That's our job. To emphasize this, to tell the believer, to tell the church, there's a problem, and it's our pursuit of wealth. There is a problem. And truthfully, church, I don't really care for new systems of economics or politics. What I care about is a change of heart. Not new laws, but new hearts. New hearts for God. And see, we have to reconcile with this, because we have to wrestle with this, because there is this selfishness, there is this greediness, there is this covetousness, this patronization, there's this pettiness, this self-importance, ungratefulness that exists in our hearts towards other people because of our wealth. And it's hard because oftentimes it's hard to make the connection. We can't see the connection. Sometimes we just say, oh, they're just awful people. That's why they think that way. But no, there is a connection to wealth. Let me give you some context. You might be sitting there right now and thinking, man, Alberto, you're really coming off way too strong right now. You need to tone it down a bit. But James doesn't. And he has very personal reasons why he doesn't back off from this subject and why he's so strict and so harsh with it. Remember who James was. Who was James? Who was the pastor of Jerusalem? The pastor of Jerusalem who saw his church split apart by persecution because of the religious elite. James, the son of a humble carpenter who was made fun of because some thought that his wife had cheated on him and had Jesus. James, a guy who grew up in that poor, impoverished town of Nazareth, as described by Philip in John chapter 1 when he says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? This is where James came from. This is what he came out of. He knows what it's like to be there, and he knows what it's like to face the oppression and disparities of wealth. And he knows that. And now he's trying to pastor his church that's spread all over the Roman Empire, hiding in caves, hiding under bushes, hiding everywhere in hopes that they wouldn't get found out and killed, and in hopes that the gospel will continue forward. And he's trying to convey this message because he understands that this is important. But the Bible doesn't stop with James. It doesn't even start with James. In fact, the Bible is unrelenting about this subject. Over 2,000 verses. 2,000! The Bible addresses helping the poor, the management of the wealth, and the cruelty of the rich. Over 2,000 verses. I'm sorry, if you're telling me something 2,000 times, that must mean it's pretty important. Some scholars say that it is one of the most talked about issues in all the Bible. Top 5 probably. Some scholars even argue that in Jesus' ministry, it was one of, if not the most important issue. 11 of his 39 parables consist of this issue. Some scholars have surmised that 2/3 of all his teachings surrounded this issue. And I believe the reason why is because Jesus spoke so much about it because he understood better than anyone the major implications wealth has on our spirit. And I want us to take a moment and be mindful of the self-deception that is already at play here. As you're listening to this, right now, you're justifying yourself. You're justifying what you're hearing right now and saying to yourself, I'm not rich. I'm not wealthy. I know you're not talking to me because that's not me. I struggle. But let's be honest. Do we really? In comparison to the tens of thousands of homeless people in our city right now, LA is the second most populated homeless city in the country. You really want to tell me that we're struggling? And that's the problem. Because this text will mean nothing to any of us if we fail to declare this here and now. We are the wealthy. We are the rich. That's us he's talking to. And so James in this text begins to outline exactly what happens to those who live in pursuit of wealth and why it happens. And the big idea I want all of us to walk away with today is this, that material wealth is far more harmful than we may immediately observe. And right now, you're listening to me, and you're probably thinking to yourself, this isn't for me. Because according to your immediate observation, you might surmise that. But I encourage you to look deeply right now. Let's look and walk through this text together and truly see whether or not is this really for us. And I believe when we do, we can respond the way the Lord intends for us to respond. Will you see with me, if you're taking notes today, number one, the condemnation of the rich. The condemnation of the rich. James breaks down this condemnation in two parts. First of all, in verse number 1, I see the call. The call. Come now, you rich men. That word come now is a phrase ago noon, which means bring forth now. Not later, not tomorrow, now. This isn't something that we're meant to postpone. This isn't something we're meant to put off. Right now, without hesitation, we need to address this issue. And as he continues to go on in the verse, he tries to convey to us this idea that our attachment to material wealth guarantees that suffering is on its way. Notice the language here. It says, come now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Weep and howl. What weeps and howls? Well, not human beings. Animals do. Almost as to imply that in our pursuit of wealth, we have behaved like animals. That in our pursuit of the next paycheck, pursuit of the next promotion, in pursuit of more monetary wealth, of nice and shiny things, we have behaved like animals. And the Bible gives us a promise. And although it's not the type of promise that we like to sing about as we sung earlier, this we know, right? There are promises that we hold on to. But this isn't a promise we like to hang on to. This is a type of promise we like to have a loose grip on and be like, oh, I drop it, that's okay. But this is a promise. This is a Bible promise, and we have to treat it as such. Even if it's not one we agree with or one that we want to see. It says, for your miseries that shall come upon you. Not that may come upon you, shall come upon you. This is a guarantee. This is happening. This is going to come. 1 Timothy 6:10 reminds us this. Paul's speaking here to the pastor Timothy, and he says, while coveting after money, some have strayed from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. The pursuit of wealth brings suffering. And we see exactly how that suffering plays out. Letter B, I see the corruption. The corruption. Now you're probably saying to yourself, oh, hang on, but money isn't bad. And that's true. We've heard that. We've heard that from here, from the very pulpit. I've even said that. Money isn't bad. At best, wealth is a tool for us to manage or steward for the betterment of all mankind. That's what it's meant for. At worst, it's a curse that will damn us to an eternity of suffering. There's a corruption to our wealth. There's a corruption to it. Notice verse 2 and 3. It says, your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. See, James here addresses three parts of wealth. He addresses assets, so your stocks, your bank account, your savings, your retirement fund, all those other funds that you have in order to cushion and create a nice little bubble for your life. Your appearance, so your clothes. Yeah, that's right, Alberto. Your sneakers. Your streetwear. Not to hear God tell me that. Because this is as much for me as it is for you. I've got a problem. I'm obsessed with appearance. These shoes don't mean anything when heaven comes. But we treat it as such. We treat things as such. We treat our clothes as such. Our appearance, and then our valuables. Notice it says, your riches, that monetary wealth are corrupted. That word corruption means it comes from an awful or evil source. Our riches come from an evil source. Your garments are moth-eaten. That means, it's eaten by moths. They're holes, it's raggedy, it's broken apart. And your gold and silver are corroded or rusted. But the worst part about all of that isn't that the fact that they're corrupted or they're moth-eaten or corroded or rusted. The worst part about it is what it says about us. Notice it says, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. What is he saying? This is James trying to address the emptiness, futility, uselessness, and suffering that wealth pretends to hide or postpone. Now, I want you to notice this, what I just said. I said, it pretends to hide the suffering or postpone it. See, because we might say, oh, but I'm like, those people look so happy. They have all this money. They have all these houses. They have all these things. They look so happy. And you know what? They might very well be very happy. But there is a promise that suffering will come. It might not be happening now, but it will happen later. So understand this. There's an emptiness to it. James states that all the wealth we have will one day witness against us and say, you're empty, hollow, and you won't ever be satisfied. The problem is that our desires have revolved around this constant pursuit of more. Jesus said it this way, where your heart is, your treasure will be there also. Or the other way around. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Way to go, Alberto. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. This week in Life Group, God reinforced this thought in my heart. God reminded me, Alberto, you're not trying to change their thoughts. You have to try and change their desires. The Spirit's going to empower you to do anything, and it's not to give people more information. It's to try and convince them that their desires need to change, that my desires need to change. As we're in Life Group, we're hearing the pastor give this talk about real desire, and he said this, and this caught my attention. I feel it applies to what we're talking about today, and it says, what our hearts desire, our feelings find desirable. Our thoughts find reasonable, and our will finds actionable. See, when we desire something, this is the progression. We feel, oh man, I would be so happy if I had that. Man, that would be so awesome if I had that. Man, if I got that job, or I got that place, or I got that car, or I got those pair of sneakers, I would be so happy. And so your thoughts begin to tell you, you know what, maybe if you save this much, you work this much, you put in little OT, you put that aside, then you can make it. You begin to reason, you begin to rationalize the purchase of this, and then when the time comes, you go for it, you do it. That might sound like, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. But it's subtle because we fail to understand. And maybe God was giving us that because he wanted us to help someone else. Or maybe the time that we were using in order to accumulate that wealth to purchase that thing and then make yourself feel good was really a misplaced desire that you should have been putting in him in your time alone in Bible and prayer and worship. And this is the truth. Our hearts cannot be separated from our treasure. As much as we want to say, oh, I'm not greedy, I'm not wealthy, no, but your heart is connected to your treasure. And if you desire something, if you treasure that, hey, your heart's going to follow. Whether you like it or not, whether you might say, oh, but I love God, I love worshiping him. Yeah, but you love your wealth as well. You love your job, you love your cushiony life. Our hearts can't be separated from that. And if that's true, then that means that our hearts are just as corrupted as our treasures. I know that's hard to hear. But that's what the word is saying here. But as James has now relayed to us the condemnation and the punishment that is to come, he then begins to explain why. What happened? What are we guilty of that justifies this punishment? I mean, this is pretty harsh, don't you think? Number 2, the crimes of the rich. He just explained what, now he's going to explain the why. But I want you to understand, church, that as we walk through each one of these 4 crimes that James lists here in the passage, there is an underlying narrative behind each and every one of them. There is a subtle voice, a subtle message behind each and every one of them. And we need to catch it, because otherwise we'll keep falling in the same sin. So letter A, hoarding. Hoarding. James 5:3, the rest of that latter part of the verse says this: you stored up treasures for the last days. Hoarding is when we inordinately hang on to things due to a false sense of security that the objects bring. And see, the thing is, whether it's out in the open, we might say, oh, Alberto, I'm not a hoarder. I'm not a hoarder. Have you seen that TV show, Hoarders? Yeah, I'm definitely not one of those people. Like, look, I mean, I have a collection of stuff, but I'm like not even close, man. Not even close. Listen, whether it's on your shelves or in your storage unit, it's still hoarding. The very fact, I was thinking about this week, the very fact that storage units is an actual business in America is a testament to our hoarding. Why in the world do we need storage units if we should be content with what we have? Shouldn't what we have in our homes be enough? But no, storage units come in. But what does it say about us? What we're saying when we hoard is, I have too much affection to these things. I love these things too much. You know something else it says? I don't trust God to provide for my future. The underlying cause of hoarding is our human tendency to want things and our inability to discern what is truly valuable. What's the message behind hoarding that's playing around in our hearts and our heads? We don't know what's truly valuable. We don't know what truly has value. We love these things and we keep them because we don't trust Him and we don't value Him. John Piper says it this way: the evidence that many of our people aren't rich toward God is how little they give and how much they own. Hebrews 13:5 says it this way: let your lives be without love of money, and be content with the things that you have. For He has said, I'll never leave you, nor forsake you. What is that verse saying? That our solution to hoarding is valuing His presence above everything else. And when we hoard, we are saying we don't value His presence as much as we value things. But it gets worse. Second crime, oppression. Oppression. I want you to see verse number 4 with me. Indeed, the wages that you kept back by fraud from the laborers who harvested your fields are crying. See, oppression is defined as this: the state of being subject to unjust treatment or control. But I define it, however, like this: oppression is an apathy or an insensibility to the needs of others that causes further discomfort, suffering, or hardship. I want you to see what James is saying here, because of the things that God gave me through my study, this was one of the toughest ones to address. To be honest, I wanted to skip over this verse, but it's here. In fact, James knew so well that this was something that would hurt us so much that he used the word indeed. Okay, big deal. He used the word indeed. What is that? Well, to understand, we need to look at the Greek. The word indeed is the Greek word idu, or meaning notice. It's an imperative word. It's a command. It means, hey, I want you to pay attention. I want you to listen up and look up here because I've got something to say. That means, and that implies that this is something that's not immediately observable. This is something that's pretty subtle underneath the layer. This is something that we don't understand right away. Because to be honest, we can be pretty dense. And so he says, indeed, the wages that you kept back by fraud from the laborers who harvested your fields are crying. See, James understood that this was an issue that was going to take illumination, that was going to need to take convincing and debating. This was something that was going to that was going to require for us to truly wrestle with. But he reminds us and says it this way in order to remind us of another passage in Deuteronomy 24. And I want you to see this as well. Deuteronomy 24, verse 14 through 15. This is an Old Testament law. And you might say by seeing this, oh, but that's the Old Testament, Alberto. We're in a New Testament now. Well, if we're in a New Testament, that means we need to encapsulate this and live this out to a higher degree. So what does this text say? It says, you may not oppress a hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of your foreigners who are in your land within your towns. I know that just stepped on a few toes already. You must give him his wages on that very day before the sun sets, for he is poor. Not because he's a good person, because he does his work well, because he treats you nice, because he speaks English. No, because he is poor. His very need requires our giving. And sets his heart on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and it be a sin to you. Specifically, this text is addressing a person you've hired for a job. But I believe that can be extended to anyone we pay for a service. So, on the general level, we might say, okay, that might be our contractor, our painter, our gardener, our housekeeper, babysitter, but also your waiter, your Uber driver, your delivery guy, your cashier, your busboy. I would even say this: members of the military, our armed forces, our first responders. We pay taxes, and that goes to them. And quite often what happens is we avoid or disrespect those people, thinking that we're higher above them. You might say, what oppression? See, when we withhold payment to people who are just trying to do their jobs for us, we become agents of oppression over them. That's what the text is saying. And oftentimes, we hold our payment hostage based on our hypocritical standard of work and success. A false narrative that says they should have worked harder. Yep, they should have tried harder. Yep, that job just, yeah, you know what? I don't like what they did there, so I'm not going to tip them. You should tip them anyway. And you should tip them more than what is required. And the other thing that we fail to understand, that we're insensitive to, isn't just their poverty and where they're at, but also the narrative that takes play that says you'll never get out from where you're at. You'll always live in the ghetto. You'll always live in that poor, impoverished place. You'll be just like all those guys on the streets. You're just going to be just like them. But recognizing this oppression simply means being aware that some people have to work much harder just to experience the things you and I take for granted. See, it's a disregard for other people's needs. That's why we do this. And it's a terrible crime. But James doesn't stop here, as if it wasn't bad enough. All right, Alberto, I get it. We're hoarders and we're oppressors, all right. But he continues on and he says, letter C, we're guilty of sensuality. Verse 5, You have lived in pleasure on the earth and have been wayward. You have nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. What is sensuality? Sensuality is defined as this: being pleased or fueled by the senses or the pursuit of pleasure. Sensuality is described by James as having an uncontrollable nature, or having the motto, I can't help it. You know what I can't help it is? I can't help it is the motto of a person whose life is dictated by their pleasures. I had to get, I just had to. I couldn't help it. I can't help it. I love seeing this guy in concert. Or I can't help it. I just had to get that coffee. I can't help it. I was just so hungry. I needed to pass through Taco Bell. I can't help it. I just had to get that top. It was so cute. Or I can't help it. Oh, that apartment was so cheap and it was such a nice area. Oh, I can't help it. And we make these decisions and rationalize them based on our inability to control our senses. And that's what the Bible tells us here. But I want you to understand that there's another subtle narrative taking place here as well behind our sin of sensuality. And it is a disregard for the sacred. When we live in pursuit of pleasure, we disregard what is sacred. When we treat everything and moment as reward or pleasure worth pursuing, we become callous to what is truly sacred. Give you an example. When we say, you know what, like there's this concert happening, or man, I just want to take the family out to this amusement park, or we just really need this vacation. And when you know very well that there's an opportunity for you to fellowship with your brothers and sisters in the Lord. What we're saying is we're disregarding the fellowship between brothers and sisters in the Lord as sacred. When we come together, this is sacred. When we just treat it like just some other thing on Sunday that we get to do, we're disregarding it as sacred. And that exposes to us that we're living a life full of pleasure. I know that's hard, but that's what the Bible tells us. And he keeps going. See, when we eat out all the time or go to somewhere just because it's famous or celebrity went there or it went viral on TikTok, and we go there to eat rather than for the sake of breaking bread with other brothers and sisters, food fails to be sacred. When we have sex outside of marriage and continually feed our porn addiction, sex fails to be sacred. When we flirt with other people that aren't our spouse or fantasize about other people or have emotional or physical adultery, our marriage fails to be sacred. You guys getting the picture? When we live a life in pursuit of pleasure, then the things that God gave us to hold as sacred fails to be sacred. They're no longer sacred. They're no longer important. They're just passive things we can just pick up at the grocery store. We have to understand this. Sensuality is a crime of devaluing and disregarding things as sacred. The last crime I see here that James lists in verse 6 is the sin and crime of condemnation. James 5:6 says, "You have condemned and killed the righteous man who does not resist you." That word condemned, we have to go to the Greek to understand its full meaning. That word in Greek is the word katadidasko, which literally means to pronounce guilty. So what does that imply? It implies that our material wealth can often produce within us a propensity to patronize, condescend, and judge others of lower esteem, explaining away their living conditions as a product of their life choices. When we say they're there because they were probably in some shady business dealings, they were probably on drugs or something, or they're probably they're just a bunch of street rats anyway. That's condemnation. And that's a sin. And the Bible tells us that when we condemn, the natural progression to condemnation is murder. You might say, well, Alberto, I've never killed anyone in my life, nor will I have ever thought to kill anyone in my life. But I remind you of Jesus' words where he says that if you have hated your brother in your heart, you've killed him. You've committed murder. So when we condemn other people, other people groups, other areas, we are condemning them and thereby murdering them. And that's a harsh accusation, but this is accusation James is saying here. You have condemned and killed. We believe, and the problem is that we believe that our wealth entitles us or justifies us to give or pass judgment on the world, person, group, or ideology because we forget our own lostness. This is because our wealth paints a false narrative, especially here in America. And mark this down, church. Our wealth paints a false narrative in our hearts that tells us our guilt has been extinguished because I'm wealthy. AKA, I'm successful and wealthy because I'm highly favored before God. God loves me. That's why he gave me my house, my car. That's why I have this amazing life. Oh, God just loves me so much. Hashtag blessed and highly favored. I mean, goodness. I mean, have you seen my house? Oh my goodness, it's just marvelous. Like God just loves me so much. My kids are all in private school, and it's a Christian private school, by the way. So just so you know, and and we live in one of the nicest neighborhoods in all of LA, Burbank, California. Yeah, that's right, where all the studios are. Yeah, that's where I live. Sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? But we do that with our spirit. And really what that is, it's simply prosperity gospel. And let me say something right now, church. As one of your pastors, prosperity gospel is of the devil. And we condemn it because prosperity gospel says that your wealth and material success is what proves God's love to you. No, that doesn't prove God's love to me. God's love is proven through his grace and faithfulness and mercy. And the fact that I get to live and enjoy simple things in life, the fact that I can have encouragement from my fellow brothers and sisters, the fact that I can open up this word and get to know who he is, that is God's love. Not my success or wealth or nice house. If I live under a rock, God will still love me just as much. And this is awful, church. It's an awful sin because we say things like, oh, they had what was coming to them. They're probably involved in some shady business dealings. They're a bunch of degenerates. That area is just full of drug dealers and gangsters. I'm not going there. I'm probably going to get jumped and killed over there. You move over there? Heck no. I don't want to live over there. That place is shady. Or one of my most hated words, that place is a ghetto. We say things like that. It just comes off the tongue. And what we're truly saying is we're judging them. We're condemning them and saying they're not worthy of my generosity, my love, or even my presence. And here's the worst part. Remember I said earlier that when we condemn, we also kill? The problem isn't just that we kill. The problem is who we kill. The text says there, you have condemned and killed the righteous man. That word in the Greek, righteous man, has two meanings. On a broader sense, it has the meaning of someone who is good, someone who is moral, but it also, in a more specific sense, has the meaning of someone with worth and dignity. With divine worth and dignity. So let's break that down for a minute. If we're all made in the image of God, then does that not mean that every single human being is made up of divine worth and dignity? So when we condemn and judge others, and say that they are this and that and patronize them, are we not then killing something that's sacred? Someone that is sacred? But then that meaning can also extend to this. Who else do we know in the Bible is described as the righteous man, the righteous one? Jesus. Oh, church. This is tough, because you know what this text is saying? By our condemnation and judgment of other people, we have killed Jesus. You mean that I've killed Jesus? I'm guilty of that? No. I'm no Judas, man. I don't know who you're talking to. No, yeah, that's what the text is saying. And see, the thing is that when we judge places, people and places, we're sending those places and people off to die. We avoid cities, areas, and people due to our judgment of them, forgetting that God sent us to be a light to them and love them back into a relationship with Him. We have to understand this, church. And this one right here is very personal to me, because I know I'm going long, church, but I really feel like this is important. Before coming here, I wrestled with the idea of going to another ministry that I knew we would get paid really well. Where I had friends who had gone there and bought their first house within the first 6 months. And I thought, man, that sounds amazing. And pastor called me and asked to come here. No guarantee of pay, no guarantee of anything. The first 2 weeks I lived in my car or crashed at one of the members of the worship team. I crashed in their apartment. And it was tough. And it was hard. And while being here, I also saw different ministries and pastors leave because LA was just too hard. LA was just too much for them. Our pastor mentioned a few weeks ago of a pastor here in LA who left LA because it just wasn't comfortable enough for him and his family. And we've seen families here that we've poured into, we've loved, and leave because they felt that LA was too expensive, too liberal, too full of homosexuals, too full of homeless people. Church, those are the people we need to reach. And yet we ignore it, all because of our pursuit of wealth. And we try to cover it up and try to hide it under this disguise of, I just want a good thing for my family. I just want to protect my family. No, you want to pursue wealth. More and more ministries are leaving cities instead of coming to them. And yet, LA and New York City are still the top two most homeless-filled cities in all of America. New York and LA are still the toughest cities to live in because of this disparity. And the truth is, we can't expect the government to do anything for us. We can't expect anyone in the White House or in Congress to do that for us. That's our job. I'm sorry, but even in the beginning of this country, there was although there was this sense and design for equality, there was still this elevation of wealth and materialism over God. And to be honest, although God is all throughout our Constitution, all throughout our political system, we can't expect the government to do God's work. We cannot. That's our job. That's our job. The Bible tells us over 2,000 verses. And that's where I get to this last point. See, because if there's supposed to be any hope for the world, it's not going to be found anywhere else but in the church. It's going to be found in the redeemed people of God. But we have to be consecrated. Number 3, the consecration of the redeemed. Using this text and trying to take this text and really see exactly what it is that this text wants us to know and follow by example, I call your attention to, first of all, the consecration of the redeemed. Letter A. What must we do? We must practice empathy. Practice empathy. James 5:4, the latter part of that verse says, "And the cries of those who harvested have entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts." Empathy is defined as feeling with people. But in order for us to feel with people, we've got to first listen to people. We have to listen to their hurt and listen to their pain. See, the Bible here says the cries have entered into the ears of the Lord. See, I believe that the reason why James put this here is because he knows that this isn't something that we can immediately observe. This isn't something that's it's right there. It's not obvious. Even the Lord had to listen intently to the cries of those who were hurting. When we realize that we are more at fault than we have originally given ourselves credit for, we can begin to feel with others. We can begin to empathize. We can choose to connect with the pain of others in a vulnerable way that allows us to see the very real possibility that we too could have been there. When we begin to listen, church, and begin to feel with other people, put ourselves there in their place, we realize, man, that could be me. That could be my boy. That could be my girl. That could be my parents. And we see that, we can begin to empathize. We begin to feel with them, cry with them. Or as Romans 12:15 says it, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Empathy. The Lord listened to their cries, but then it also says, entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts. There's meaning behind that word, that title, Lord of hosts. And that's where I get to letter B. We must strive for equity. Strive for equity. What is equity? Well, let me first make a distinction between equity and equality. Equality is ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and talents. Equity is giving more to those who need it. In other words, although both things promote fairness, equality is based upon treating others the same regardless of need, while equity achieves this through treating people differently dependent on need. I remind you of Deuteronomy 24, where it says, hey, we ought to pay them because they're poor, because they have a need. Not because they're good or because they're a good worker, but because they have a need. In other words, it's up to us to provide those things, to provide equity for the world. Romans 15:1 says it this way, we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of the weak and not please ourselves. Philippians 2:2-3, and our Pastor Josh even mentioned it earlier, right? That generosity ought to be an attribute of the Christian life. Let me jump over to verse 2. Let nothing be done out of strife or conceit, but in humility let each esteem the other better than himself. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. And this may be hard for us to practically understand and do, but that's why I mention that title, Lord of Hosts. So what's the point? What does Lord of Hosts mean? Lord of Hosts is a title of God that has been mentioned over 281 times throughout the Bible. And it means the God who stands up and fights for the defenseless. One commentator defines it this way. It's a title that means the God who has all ranks of beings and creatures at his disposal, and who sets all in their several places, hears the oppressed by reason of the cruelty or injustice of the oppressor, and will give orders to some of those hosts to avenge the wrongs unmercifully. That's the Lord of hosts. So what should be our response? That we rise in defense of the poor and needy. Whether poor in status or poor because of their mentality. that we rise in defense to them through love, connection, sacrifice, and generosity. That we get involved in things like Pop Drop. That we get involved in caring for those at the Skid Row mission. That we just take it upon ourselves to go down to downtown LA and, hey, buy someone a pair of shoes. Give them food and make a meal for them. Just take it upon yourself to do it. But also to do that within here, our very church. Knowing that there are people here in our very church who are struggling as well. That aren't as wealthy and aren't as well off as others. The best example I can think for this is found in Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4, verse 32-35. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful visual pictures of what empathy and equity can do in the church. It says, all the believers were of one heart and one soul, and no one said that he possessed what was his own, but to them all things were common. With great power, the apostles testified to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was on them all. There was no one among them who lacked. For all those who were owners of land or houses, they sold them, and brought the income from what was sold and placed it at the apostles' feet. And it was distributed to each according to his need. That's the image Jesus, that God plays for us to follow. This is what it looks like when material wealth is stewarded for his kingdom. When the redeemed people of God are consecrated to the kingdom of heaven, where all the miseries and crimes that material wealth can produce are extinguished. That's the picture. That's the target. That's what we need to aim for. There's hope. We have the Lord of hosts. We have the Lord who defends us and stands up for us. And he can do it through us if we allow him to do so. May we relinquish these crimes over to him, find healing and redemption in him, and find the power to do differently. Let's pray together. Lord, we love you and we are thankful